Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. It's been a while, nearly a year. I started a job about a year ago that totally changed my life and my schedule, and I'm just now adjusting to it and finding time to film. Honestly, it's not so much about finding time as finding energy, but whatever, that's neither here nor there. If you're new to this channel, my name is Melanie. Welcome. So glad to have you here. I have multiple interests in life, and as a hobby, I occasionally make videos talking about them. One of those hobbies being reading. I love books. I like to learn. I love to learn. I try to read a little bit of everything. With fiction, I want to read both books that I like and books that I don't like. And with nonfiction, I want to read books about things that interest me, but also just about anything that can give me general knowledge and perspectives that I both agree with and disagree with. I'm just looking to have as much of a well balanced perspective of life as possible and to learn as much as I can about this world while I'm here. Now, I do have books that I prefer to read, things that I'm a little more interested in or enjoy more. So, my books that I choose to read do lean more in that direction, but there's definitely exceptions to this rule. So, with that said, let's get started. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I just want to talk about these books, quickly say what they were about, what I thought of them, and give them that rating out of 5 stars. Because what would a video like this even be if you don't put a rating in there? Am I right? I'm joking, guys. Obviously, that's not the most important thing, but I do enjoy giving books ratings, so I'm gonna do it. Also, just a quick note, these are books that I finished in 2026, not that I started in 2026. A few of them I did start in 2025 and just didn't finish until the new year. And also, you might not consider these all to be books because some people don't consider audiobooks to be books, even though they're wrong. And also, some of these are more of short stories. So, if you want to consider something a book or not, that's fine. I really don't care. But I'm just giving a disclaimer ahead of time. The first book that I finished in 2026 was the audiobook for Eight Nights to Win Her Heart by Miri White, which was a cute Hanukkah romance. I did enjoy this book. It was pretty simple, but very fast to read, fast to get through. The characters were lovely, the story was lovely. It was a bit two dimensional for me. Everything was very predictable. Nothing incredibly interesting happened, but it was overall satisfying, and it was nice to get a holiday romance that was about Jewish people, especially because I'm Jewish myself. Regardless of that, I still appreciated seeing a story that was a Jewish holiday romance because you never see that. I'm not like too big on representation. Like, I think, of course, everybody should be able to find stories that reflect their personal experience. It's not the biggest deal to me. I'm totally just as happy reading a Christmas romance, of course, as long as it's, well written enough. But it was a nice change of pace. With that said, it wasn't anything too profound. I'm going to give Eight Nights to Win Her Heart a 3.6 stars. The second book that I completed this year was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, and I thought that this was a fantastic book. It was actually one of my favorite books that I read this year so far. It's by a Japanese author. She also wrote Earthlings, which I'm hoping to read in the near future. This was my first taste of her writing, and I really enjoyed it. It's an interesting, very unique book about a woman who's 36. I'm also 36, so I related to this a bit, especially because I have experience like working in a store and like putting on that face for customers, and I don't know, I just related to like both her experience as a store owner, but also as like an unconventional 36-year-old that people always have questions for, right? But with that said, so this woman, she is a convenience store worker, and she kind of learned at a very young age that she had to mask her true self because her actual personality was not acceptable to other people. So, up until the age of 18, she just entirely stayed quiet because she didn't know what appropriate behavior was. So, she just figured it would be easier to not say anything to anybody. But when she turned 18, she went to get a job and she worked at a convenience store. And as she said in the book, this was the first time anybody showed her how to properly behave. So the behavior and personality that they trained her to have is actually the behavior and personality that she developed for the following 18 years of her life, because she's 18 when she started and she's 36 by the time that we meet her as the narrator of this novel. And I thought it was very interesting because when she was 18, she was doing great. She nails this job. She's excellent at it. It's the one thing she really thrives at in life. Like, she doesn't have interest in a real career. A real career. She's perfectly happy doing what she's doing. Why does she need a real career, right? She can financially support herself. She doesn't want to get married. She doesn't want a family. But everybody around her is pressuring her into having and doing these things that they say that she's supposed to do, even though she genuinely has no interest. And everybody around her is so concerned about what's going to happen to her if she doesn't become normal. But she just wants to live a life that makes her happy. And while me and her definitely have many differences, I definitely felt um, like she was a female main character that I related to more than the typical female main character. Her and I are both, somewhat unconventional 36-year-olds. I enjoyed that element, but I also just thought it was really well written. The characters were interesting, the writing was great, the plot was great. I love this story. I have really nothing bad to say about it. The one flaw that kind of annoyed me was I felt like the author started hinting at the fact that she had violent tendencies, and then that really never went anywhere. So it was kind of like, why did you even put this into the story? Maybe you intended to do something with it and you just didn't have the time or couldn't fit it in. But maybe those little like tendencies could have been edited out if they weren't going to lead to anything. Anyway, I gave this book 4.4 stars, and I loved it. I don't really know what else to say. Moving on. The next book that I completed was the audiobook For a Limited Time Only by Pung Shepherd. This was part of the Time Traveler Passport series, a series of 6 short stories that Amazon put out. And honestly, this is probably my least favorite of the 6. The first 2 having been completed in 2025. This was the first of the series I read in 2026. And I don't even really remember that much, to be honest. It had to do with like commercial time traveling and trying to find more time and avoiding inevitable disasters in your life. And it was pretty tragic. I don't want to say it was bad, it just wasn't very memorable or profound to me. I just felt like it was trying more to be a good story than actually being a good story, if that makes sense. I ended up giving this one 3.3 stars, and in my opinion, it was definitely the weakest of the 6 stories in that collection. The next book that I read and completed in 2026 was The Coldest Winter Ever. This is definitely not my typical read. My best friend told me that she absolutely loved this book when she read it in high school, and obviously for both of us being in our late 30s, that was quite a while ago. So it was nice. She got to revisit it, and I read it along with her. And this book actually surprised me. It was pretty good. Now, it's interesting because the narrator is like a teenage daughter of a drug lord in the projects in Brooklyn, New York, and she speaks just like that. Like, the book is narrated in her voice. The way she writes, it's not what you think of when you think of literary. This is classified as urban literature, and I actually felt like this was a pretty profound book. Like, this book ended up being way deeper than I expected it to. It's all about your life choices, how you handle yourself when things around you fall apart, and the trajectory of somebody who doesn't actually have any morals or values and where that will end you up in life. And I think that that is an absolute great story. It's just a great message and a great moral to put out, and I really have a lot of respect to Sister Soldier for writing this book and doing all the work that she did back in the day to try to uplift her community. Like, I think that more people should try to uplift their community in the way that she's trying to uplift hers. So much credit to her. I ended up giving this book 3.7 stars. I can't say this was my favorite book ever, but it was pretty good. The next book was The Pisces by Melissa Broder. This was also a pretty interesting book. I'm actually a Melissa Broder fan. I think her books are very interesting. Like, she's very contemporary and her writing is very, very modern, but she also puts a lot of wit and depth into her books, and they're just very unique. She definitely is a great voice of our time, and I appreciate her so much. This is a story about a woman who is a love addict and is kind of has a toxic approach to dating and finding love in general, and just really is a toxic, selfish person. But she is searching for love and pretty much will do nearly anything to get it. But just how far will she go? Anyway, she finds a merman that she falls in love with, and the story kind of unravels from there. I'm not going to say too much. I don't want to spoil it. But I thought the writing was great. I thought the story was interesting. It was actually probably my least favorite of her three novels that I've read, but I still gave it 4.1 stars. Like, I am a Melissa Broder fan. I think she's awesome. And I would definitely recommend it to people who like weird girl literature and romance type books. The next book that I completed was the audiobook for Unlimited Power by Tony Robbins. It's like a 1 hour self help book, if you can even call it that. 80% of it is like a recording from one of his seminars with just a little bit of commentary in there. So it's hard to really consider it a book when it is literally a recording of a seminar that he did. Do you see what I'm saying? But it's published as a book, so I'm counting it as a book. I enjoyed it. I don't even remember too much about what he said, to be honest. What really I took away from this book was that he was talking about integrity and living in alignment with your values, which is obviously something that everybody could stand to do. I ended up giving this book 3.9 stars. The next book that I completed was the audiobook for A Visit to the Husband Archive, which is by Kayleigh Bradley. Not sure if I said that correctly. Not sure if I said half these names correctly. My apologies. But with that said, this was the fourth book from the Time Traveler's Passport series, and very much unlike the last one I was talking about, this was probably my favorite book of the series. I just enjoyed her writing. I loved how she uses her language to build the world and how she expresses the characters and the situation that they find themselves in. This is a very dystopian story. I don't remember it too well, but it's painting this really bleak future where history has pretty much been erased, or rather, people's memories are being erased. And strangely enough, people don't really get married out of love anymore. It's just something that is like prescribed to them by a doctor, as was for the protagonist in this story. And she goes to this archive collection vendor of husbands, and also they never really explain why, but some of these husbands are women. But the one that she gets is a man who is from before everything turned so dystopian, and he remembers what the past used to be like, and he has like old knowledge and wisdom, and his memory hasn't been erased. It was quite interesting. There's definitely some holes in the story, definitely some random elements that I didn't feel like quite worked. She also wrote The Ministry of Time, but I thought it was a good story, just with a few plot holes, and I think it could have been better and more well edited. I still gave it 4.2 stars. The next book I read was Half His Age by Jennette McCurdy, a controversial one. She obviously is the same author who wrote I'm Glad My Mom Died, a memoir that was absolutely phenomenal. Or if you haven't read that, that's one of the best memoirs I've ever read. This was her first work of fiction. This was a story from a teenage girl's point of view who is groomed by her teacher, although in a way she's somewhat the predator. It definitely gives a lot of look and insight into how not being whole with ourselves and in a healthy place will lead us to making poor decisions in love, life, and so on, and how that influences the people around us. She clearly was heavily influenced by her mom. I don't want to give too much away, but I do enjoy her writing. I ended up giving this book 4.3 stars. I definitely think it was excellent. I think she has so much potential as a writer of fiction. I want to see more work from her moving forward. I just didn't think it was like good enough to go beyond the 4.3. Book number 9 was actually just a book for language learners. It was called Spanish Short Stories for Beginners, written by Sebastian P. Cotillo. I honestly can't even really remember anything about it. I just thought that the stories were, I think it's like every story was like 1 page long, and they were hardly stories. It was like, this guy went to the park. He and his dog played ball. Too. Like, they were slightly more interesting than that, but not much. But for what the book sets out to do, which is to teach you Spanish and have you read short stories at a very beginner level, I thought it was pretty well written. I gave it 3.9 stars. Like, if this book was not for language learners, it would probably be like a 2. But that's not how I'm going to evaluate a book with an entirely different purpose than to be literary. Book number 10, Nation of Victims by Vivek Ramaswamy. I personally love Vivek Ramaswamy. I don't necessarily agree with Vivek on everything, but I think he's one of the smartest, most interesting, and well spoken and respectful politicians. I agree with a lot of his policies and ideas. This book is pretty much a deep dive into how America has become a nation of victims, where victimhood is becoming a form of social currency, and how we use our victim status as leverage in order to get ahead in life. I completely agree with his thesis. I thought that a lot of the points that he made were very well articulated. I appreciated a lot of his ideas. I'm not going to say I agree with everything he said, but at the end of the day, this book was actually incredibly dry and took me like 8 months to get through. It didn't read for me the way like listening to him does. Maybe if I listened to an audiobook and he narrated it, I'd feel differently. But like as the written word, this book took me a while just because I was kind of bored reading it as much as I agree with the points that he was making. With that said, I gave this book 3 stars. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I do like the ideas that he shares. And the final book that I read in January was An Outlaw and a Lady, which was written by none other than the beautiful and amazing Jessi Coulter, who was a musician back in the day. I mean, she might still actually be making music, which is pretty incredible if you ask me. She was big, I believe it was like the 70s when her and her husband, the absolute legend Waylon Jennings, were creating music. So this was the story of not only her life as a musician and the wife to the great Waylon Jennings, but also how she started in a religious family and left her faith and then found her way back to Christ. Now, regardless of what you believe and what your own personal denominations are, I thought that this was just an absolutely beautifully written book. I learned way more about Waylon Jennings in this book than I did from his own biography as well. So if you are a Waylon Jennings fan and you want to know more about his life, especially if you've already read his biography and you didn't feel like fully satisfied by that and you want to know like all the details that Waylon wasn't willing himself to say, oh man, do I recommend this book. Beautiful book, beautifully written, great story, just an amazing life to learn about. I gave this book 4.3 stars. Book number 12 and the first book that I completed in February was the audiobook, another one from Time Traveler's Passport, All Manner of Things Shall Be, by, I believe her name is pronounced Olivia Blake. This one was really interesting. It was like about time traveling vampires from different historical periods who were all like living in a house together. Um, this one was bizarre. I liked the writing. I thought it was just like a little too absurd for me. Like just so many disjointed elements that were trying to all be thrown together. But it was cute, very whimsical. I thought there were some weird holes and I don't know. Like it was good, but it definitely was flawed. I gave it 3.8 stars. Book number 13. This is one that I don't know if people are going to consider it because some people don't consider manga to be books, but it was Haikyuu Volume 1, which I read in German. I absolutely love Haikyuu. Like, I'm not like a huge anime person, but some of my favorite shows are animes. I just don't go out of my way to watch them. I just like what I like. But I think Haikyuu is just such a brilliant, wholesome, fun show to watch. I wasn't even into volleyball before I watched the show, and then this show completely changed the trajectory of my life because when I met my boyfriend who's a volleyball player, our first conversation was about Haikyuu. So I think that's really cute. It always warms my heart to think about looking back all these years. I just absolutely love it. It's about a boys' high school volleyball team, unlikely combination of characters who create an amazing team and fight their way to the top. I gave this book 4.2 stars. The next book is story number 6 and the final installation of the Time Traveler's Passport series titled Cronus by P. Djèlí Clark. This is a story about a black woman who works in commercial time travel tourism and discovers that history has been altered intentionally by those in power in order to maintain power, as well as the oppression of others, more specifically minorities, particularly black people. Now, there was a lot about this book that I liked, and some things that I found fairly off putting. First off, this was a great idea for a story, and I thought that the plot was well put together. It was fairly entertaining, and I was excited to see the outcome for the protagonist and the fate of her world. What I enjoyed most about this story, though, was how thought provoking it was. It makes you wonder if time travel actually existed, what would those who are in power use it for, and how would they manipulate it to their own advantage? Now, there were a few things I did not like about this story as well. First and foremost, the characters were painfully two-dimensional. It felt like the only things that mattered to who they were as a person were the identities that they had as well as their collective struggles, which seems to contradict the point of wanting to show the importance of honoring who a person actually is. Also, Rather than providing new commentary and insight to the very real issue of racism, it seemed to be trying to hammer in talking points that are more cliches than actual insights, and that it was more of an excuse to illustrate political talking points rather than actually tell a story. This resulted in a potentially exciting and creative premise, feeling a bit tired and unoriginal. And my final criticism is that while the writing wasn't particularly bad, it wasn't particularly great either, and I just felt that the story would have benefited from stronger writing. Overall, the story had a lot of potential, but I don't think it quite lived up to it. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. The next book that I finished was More Than Petticoats, Remarkable Florida Women, which is part of a series that talks about remarkable women throughout history from various settings. Being a Floridian myself, I really enjoyed learning about the incredible women who have helped shape Floridian history. These are women who have experienced various walks of life, and yet they have all made their own impact. I thought this was a very interesting book, a little bit on the dry side, but I was very happy to get the information that I did out of it. This book's written by Elin Wright, and I decided to give it 4.1 stars. The next book is called Spanish Short Stories for Beginners, which ironically has the same title as the last book in Spanish that I read. Literally the same exact name, two different books. This book doesn't even have an author. It just comes from a company called Fluent with Stories. I don't remember this book, like, at all. I only read it a month ago or 2 months ago at this point, and I all I can tell you is that I must not have found it as well written or interesting as the first book with the same title, because I gave this book 3.4 stars. And I probably only gave it a rating that high just for the fact that, like, it helps you learn the language, which is what it set out to do. But the stories weren't interesting. The writing wasn't really great, even translated. The next book I read was another one that really stood out to me this year. It was a memoir called I Deliver Parcels in Beijing by Huan Yan. And once again, apologies for mispronouncing the name. This is a memoir written by a man who has taken various odd jobs in China. Obviously, the main one of them being a parcel delivery man who worked for, like, one of those big companies like an Amazon or a Temu. It just gave you a great insight into what the work of somebody who takes on this kind of position in a totally different country from ours lives like. I really loved his writing. I think a lot of people would find it dry, but I definitely felt, at least in the first half of the book, like I could listen to him speak forever. Although by the time it got to the second half of the book, funny enough, I was, like, really ready to be done with the book. So take it for what you will. Above all else, it was the writing for this book that did it for me. But he also had a lot of interesting insight and perspectives, and I found myself relating to him quite often and also learning a lot about the culture in China. I gave this book 4.1 stars. The next book that I completed was the audio book called Immer wieder Sascha, and that was by Angelica Bohn, and that is a German author. It's actually a book that's written for German learners. Of all the books that I've read that are written for people who are learning languages, I am just such a fan of Angelica Bohn's work because it's good enough to be a book just for its own merit. I think that she is a brilliant author and is just so creative and unique. Maybe like a bit of absurdism, a bit of magical realism. This is a book about a man who doesn't like his name because his name is Sascha Frauenschuh, which translates to Sasha Woman's Shoe, which is pretty funny. Like, nobody in his life takes him seriously, and he's just about had it. Like, his life is falling apart. He lost his fiance, he didn't get the promotion he wanted at his job, and he has just about had it, and he's about to go to City Hall and change his name when this mystical guy, Yannick, he comes along and tells him, oh, there's, what was it, six other people with the same name in Germany, and he somehow makes it so Sasha jumps from, like, to each person's body and, like, lives in them, in their body, and lives their experience so he can learn a lesson about how having his name doesn't affect him. It's the type of person that he is that really makes a difference in his destiny and plays a role in where he ends up in life. I just thought this was such a fun book. Was it perfect? No. I mean, when you write at a lower level because you want people to understand who don't speak the language very well, it's inevitable that it won't be quite as good as you could if you were writing purely for the sake of writing. but she's such a talented author. I gave this book 4.3 stars. The next book was Stephen King's The Body, which has been adapted into the very well-known movie Stand By Me. This is the story of four 12-year-old boys who go on a journey to search for the body of a missing kid around their age, and it's narrated by one of them, Gordy LaChance, who is recounting the story as an adult and a famous author. This is a tale of friendship, life lessons, coming of age, and facing mortality. What I liked most about the story were not only the insights and relatability, but as is characteristic of King's writing, the characters are what stand out the most. King does beautiful character work, not only individually, but in their relationships with one another as well. This book also has some iconic scenes, such as the one with Chopper, or the train track scene, or even the pie eating contest, which was really a story Gordy wrote as a child and shared with the boys during their travels. This book didn't captivate me quite the same way The Stand did, but it definitely was a satisfying, heartfelt, and worthwhile read. I'm going to give it 4.4 stars. The next book I read was Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Also a very short book, but incredibly impressive for what it is able to accomplish in the near 100 pages. It's a story of two men during the Great Depression who are jumping from ranch to ranch. They're looking for work, and one of them is small but intelligent, and the other is, I guess he's like a half-wit, and he is not aware of like his own strength, but he's a good worker. And they've kind of been sticking with each other their whole lives, even though Lenny, the less intelligent of the two, continues to get them into trouble, and they finally end up in this new situation, and they're dreaming about the future. But lo and behold, history does repeat itself, so tragedy eventually strikes. I won't say more than that. It's such a short story, there's not too much to give away, but it's just brilliantly written. I don't have much bad to say about it. I'm giving it 4.7 stars. Was that the highest one that I've done so far this year? I think so. And finally, the last book that I finished in 2026 was actually the sequel to Immer wieder Sascha, and it was called Nie wieder Merle. Like I said, it was a sequel to Immer wieder Sascha, but this book somehow managed to take the premise of the last one and just spin it in a completely different direction, keep the story entirely fresh. This one was just like so absurd that at times I got a little bit annoyed with it, but ultimately, like, I thought it was a great story, especially for a book that's written for people to learn German. I'm giving this book 4.2 stars. And guys, that is everything that I read in 2026. Hope you enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books if you've read them, or if you have any suggestions for books you'd like for me to talk about. I'm always interested in hearing about books that other people want to recommend to me. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.